Hi, I'm Yann Ilunga. I'm a podcasting and lead generation consultant, international speaker, and podcaster. I've been podcasting since 2014. And to date, I've published probably over 400 podcast episodes. Most of them have been interviews. And joining me, as always, is...
Hi, I'm Connie Steele. I'm an author, podcaster, and marketing and strategy expert. I've spent most of my career actually in the corporate world, specifically in technology. And as far as a podcaster, I'm also a podcast host for a venture capital firm and creator and host of my own podcast called Strategic Momentum that's focused on helping the next generation of leaders understand the business of work.
Connie, I think it's safe to say that between the two of us, have been involved with podcasting and different podcast formats for quite a while. And I think it would make sense for us to go through different formats and perhaps try to share what we consider the pros and cons for each scenario. So try to say when we think a specific podcast format would make more sense or less sense. What do you think? How does it sound?
I think that'd be great.
Okay, so I think the first format to start with, because I think is the one that most people, most companies actually think is the best, are interview-based podcasts. So Connie, maybe I'm going to let you start with this one, since I know you've been an expert at podcast interviews, both as the host and the guest. What do you consider some of the positive aspects of potentially having a corporate podcast that revolves around hosting interviews?
Well, when you have that situation, you have that host who can be truly the voice of your company or your brand. And they are considered that expert who then is able to not only share their point of view on the topic that you're covering, but more importantly, they are able to really pull those amazing insights from the guests that you want to have on your show. I think many people, again, are familiar with this format because they've probably listened to, NPR, How I Built This, or a lot of other shows where you have that great host that you love and they have this wonderful insight, but they're pulling on these really interesting guests from across different subject matter areas potentially, or maybe reflect different customers, and they offer a different lens of the subject you're trying to cover, but it creates that level of variety, engagement, and interest in a different way. So that's one format that I know most people are probably familiar with, but other ones that I think a lot of us have seen are those those individual style ones, which is, the monologue essentially. So Yann, I know you've done several of those. Why don't you share, what the benefits are, and maybe some of key insights in doing something like that.
The interview-based podcast, here we're typically talking about a one-on-one conversation. So there is one host interviewing one guest. And I think some of the benefits of hosting an interview-based podcast are the fact that you have a variety of viewpoints, at least two viewpoints. Sometimes they may be the exact same viewpoints, but in some cases, they may even be polarizing or opposite viewpoints. So the host may have a point of view on a specific topic and the guest has a completely different opinion, which makes for a very insightful, diverse, and interesting conversation. I personally think that hosting a corporate podcast that leverages interviews makes a lot of sense, especially if you want to showcase the diversity of the company. You want to show the different layers. You want to have the listener sort of become part of the atmosphere of the company. So you may have somebody interviewing different employees, for example, or something like that. That could be interesting, as for the listener, they become a sort of fly on the wall and they can listen to some conversations. On the other hand, it could also be a great way to put your customers, for example, in the spotlight. You may do interviews with customers. And I remember in a different video, you were talking about this, Connie. So showcasing your customers could be a very good thing in terms of leveraging an interview-based podcast. And it goes without saying that if you're planning, or if one of your goals is to actually leverage the podcast for networking purposes, then an interview-based podcast is the way to go. On the opposite spectrum, we have a solo podcast or an individual podcast, as you said, Connie. For me, I think that that's great to leverage when you really want to be in the spotlight. You want to showcase your expertise and you don't want anything, so to say, to be in the way. So you want to showcase what you're capable of. You want to share your expertise, or even you want to showcase your storytelling abilities. It goes without saying that having pressure on your shoulders can be a good thing, but also a negative thing, because there you don't have anybody that can help you. When it's one-on-one or two people like we are doing right now, that it's co-hosts, for example, one can help the other one out and vice versa. But when it's just you, things are a little bit different. One point that I want to make when it comes to hosting an individual podcast, because that's something I'm often asked, and I think it's a question that somebody watching Ask Connie may ask him or herself, and is, how do I actually go about talking to myself basically for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 25 minutes, however long the episode is going to be? The way I approach this when I have to host solo podcasts, because as you said, I've done that several times, is very simple. Instead, technically, sure, I am talking to my wall or to my webcam. But what I do is I picture the listener who's listening to me. In some cases, for some of my shows, I actually got to meet listeners in person, so I can actually picture a specific person. But otherwise, if you have never had the chance to meet a listener in person, you can just think of, okay, I'm addressing the person who's listening to this. So even though you are technically talking to yourself, you want to do it in a conversational way. So like I'm doing right now, let's imagine for a second that Connie wasn't here. I'm talking to you. That's the same approach I have when I host an individual podcast or a solo podcast. Connie, anything you want to add, whether it's about the interview-based podcast, a solo podcast, or individual podcast?
So I think another consideration for a solo podcast would be the application for really internal communications. So if you have leadership who is looking to convey a key initiative, or they're trying to share a perspective that they have on maybe what's going on in, their business or where they may want to go, doing a solo podcast in that sense would be really relevant. Instead of having that corporate email that comes out from the CEO or the head of marketing or whomever that key leader is, doing a short podcast, really having them convey what they're thinking, what they're feeling so that they can connect with employees, this would be a really great format to do so. And yes, it isn't necessarily easy if you haven't done it before, as Yann has mentioned. But you know what? A way to be able to do that is to have somebody there, just almost as that stand-in, as if they are having that back and forth discussion, but really you just have somebody to channel your message to. So similar to how, Yann and I are having this, interview style conversation, you could do it such that it's really just me in this case talking to Yann, but I just have somebody that I am looking at, I am focused on, so that it helps you get comfortable and helps you really come across as more authentic in conveying the, important news or information that you want to share.
How an individual podcast can be leveraged inside an organization. I really like that, because I think in most cases, we usually think as a podcast as a tool for external communication, but as you have just shared with us, it can work like a charm for internal communication as well. And I like the tip you shared of having somebody there as a stand-in. I think is easier to actually see somebody and look at them. Perhaps if you're recording video, for example, like we're doing right now, you could have the person stand right behind the webcam or the camera. It goes without saying that, for example, for me now, if I had a person stand in and he or she was on one side of the webcam, you would see me be like this, and you may wonder, okay, where is he looking at? But if the person were to stand right behind the camera or webcam and I looked at them, it would still look as if I'm actually looking at you. Now, Connie, if we move on to a couple of additional podcast formats that one could potentially decide to go for when it comes to their corporate podcast, I think what we are doing right now is a good example of that. And it would be a co-hosted podcast or show. And then we have a panel of discussion. So maybe if we start with whatever the two format you prefer, Connie, what are your thoughts? One, do you think it makes sense to embrace a co-hosted podcast, and when should a company or an organization consider hosting a panel of discussion type of podcast?
So for a co-host situation, I think that's great when you really see that there's chemistry between two people in your organization, and there's this wonderful dynamic that they provide that offers a level of energy to the show that you wouldn't have otherwise. And let's face it, not everybody is really comfortable doing this on their own. So when you have a partner in crime that can help you plan, but can help you also fundamentally execute this such that you can play off of each other when you're interviewing a guest, or when you have these situations where it's just two people talking about a topic, it just in the beginning can be less intimidating to do. Plus, when you are discussing various topics, one can really stimulate the other to provide a very interesting point of view. And so that dialogue in the end just becomes so much richer. The panel situation is when you are looking for multiple points of view, as you had mentioned. That's the benefit of having this interview style format. But within a corporate environment, there are so many different voices that provide a different perspective on how the company operates and the value that each of these team members can bring. So when you can have somebody in marketing, in product, in engineering, in sales, or customer service, and so forth, you get this really interesting opportunity to see how the entire company can work together to deliver a compelling product and experience, and you'll get different points of view. Or in this situation, you may want to focus as a singular host. You may have a panel of people you want to interview because you're looking for different perspectives and insights. And subsequently, each of these different guests can play off one another and can honestly elevate the conversation to a place that you wouldn't have considered. And you get such rich insights at the end of the day.
The diversity you mentioned, if there are different departments and we want to include the different voices in the conversation. You also said it, when it comes to co-hosting a show, there needs to be good chemistry, and it's important. You want to co-host a podcast with somebody you genuinely would see yourself having a cup of coffee with, a cocktail with, dinner with, and you guys would just be able to keep talking. And I don't think you need to necessarily be, let's say, having the same traits, meaning even outside the corporate podcasting world, there are co-hosts of all types, sisters who have pretty much the same age range. There may be a father and a daughter, or a mother and a son. There could be people, like in our case, Connie, who have different levels of expertise, different age range, different ethnic groups, different geographical locations, different whatever. It's really about, think about it as a puzzle. You want to, ideally, I think, for me personally, I think that a great combination of co-hosts is a puzzle where a person brings some of the pieces and the other person brings some of the pieces. So I personally feel that oftentimes the more diverse the one co-host is from the other, the more interesting overall the conversation is gonna be. As far as having to moderate a conversation, that's a skill that may require some time for you to actually acquire, because everybody's different by nature, culturally as well. There are differences. Some people may be more on the shy side. Some people will monopolize the microphone. So you want to make sure that that everyone actually has the opportunity to share their 2 cents. And it's your job to obviously contribute to the conversation, to bring the conversation forward, but at the same time, also to make sure that everybody is involved so that, it's not only one person talking all the time or most of the time, and everybody else is just kind of listening, so to say. So far we have covered the interview-based podcast. We talked about the individual/solo podcast, and now we've talked about the panel of discussion and the co-hosted podcast. One thing I want to share, Connie, is how to go about the formats we mentioned. For example, the panel of discussion. You can host a panel physically or remotely, but you can also be creative. And I quickly want to share an example with you. And that's one of the podcasts I created, which is called the Podcast Lab. When I created that podcast, I wanted to showcase my expertise as a podcasting consultant, but at the same time, I still wanted to have contributions by other experts because they would make for a more diverse conversation. However, I didn't want to host regular interviews or even a roundtable conversation like many other podcasters in that space did. So what I decided to do instead is I changed my approach. I tried to be more creative. I used a tool called SpeakPipe, which enabled me to add a widget or a button on my website, or in this case, on a specific web page on my site. And then I contacted a few experts and I sent them a few questions related to different podcasting related topics and asked them, would you mind going to this page, click record, and just send me your answers for each point? And then what I did is I took one answer from a person, an answer from another person, and I kind of made a collage. So technically, I didn't really interview them. However, through editing, through post-production, I was able to include them into the conversation. So I would basically say, today we're talking about podcast formats, and I asked my friend, client, and colleague, Connie Steele, for her insights, and here's what she had to say. And then I would play the clip, in this case, of Connie sharing her expertise. So I just wanted to share that because I think there are quote unquote traditional ways to go about certain things, but you can also be creative and do things differently. And I wanted to share that example. Connie, any final things you want to talk about? What about repurposing content? What if somebody is new to corporate podcasting, but perhaps they already have content that they've created, let's say, for YouTube or something like that? Any thoughts on how that can be used, if it can be used at all?
Oh, yes. I think repurposed content is one of the almost most effective ways that organizations can leverage valuable content and information that they've had in the past. It's probably not obvious because many are just used to the interview style or maybe panel style or monologue style that they commonly see. But many folks probably are familiar with Gary Vee, and a lot of his podcasts are just repurposed from previous episodes or conferences or things that they have. But the key thing is that this is a way where you can really stitch together a pretty compelling story of, work that you've done in the past, but narrated in such a way that creates an interesting perspective on maybe customer success stories that you have, status on new product development that you've done, or different trends and insights that you have seen by maybe the fact that some of your team were speakers in previous events. And if you happen to have a video or audio recordings of them, you could clip it, put it together, and showcase the voice of many of these people in your company who happen to be thought leaders that in an overarching way showcases, the thought leadership and progressive trends that they're offering. But another piece too is thinking creatively like you did, is that you could think of a very different way of developing your case studies, your testimonials, and leveraging bits and pieces of content from different sources and showcasing various voices, which all come together to communicate a very specific objective. So it's not that it needs to be a sort of in the moment situation where you're interviewing somebody directly. It could be pulling things from a year or 2 years ago, but it's still incredibly relevant. The whole premise is to pull together that insight, those tips, that advice that you have happens to be from different sources, but you literally stitch that together such that it creates a really compelling narrative to deliver on a particular, point of view that you've got. So that's how I look at really that value of repurposing what you have, because let's face it, many companies struggle with creating content, and to create new content, you don't always have time. So if you're able to go back into that library that you have, say, wait, we do have some great stuff. How do we think about it creatively and use it in such a way that can accomplish our objectives?
Yeah, and the example you share, Connie, it's a show that I would recommend everybody listens to, because it's an excellent example of how to strategically repurpose the content you have already created. As you said, Karen Vaynerchuk, in the show, there is all kinds of content, including presentations for conferences, and he just repurposes those. So if, as you said, Connie, if somebody's here with you and I, and their organization is struggling with content creation, or you've been thinking, well, we would like to start a corporate podcast, but we aren't sure content strategy-wise how to proceed, I would encourage you to look at what you may have been creating for different channels. Perhaps it's YouTube, perhaps it's for LinkedIn, perhaps it's through your blog, because you may even have written content, blog posts, email lists, email newsletters, whatever, that you can leverage for the podcast. You could literally read some of those or use those as, let's say, the key points that the episode is going to revolve around, and you use them as the sort of script or list that you go through. And of course, if you need some help with corporate podcasting, really pretty much any aspect of corporate podcasting, we are here to help, right, Connie?
Absolutely. And you can go to flywheelassociates.com/podcasting. And underneath that, you'll see information on resources, a guide, and just services that we can offer.
There you have it. Now you know a little bit more about the different formats your podcast could have, some things to consider. And Connie just mentioned a link that is the perfect next step to this video. So if you have questions, you need help, the link Connie mentioned is the best way to go.